He came into the world on June 28th, 1491, not as a mere boy, but as a symbol of promise. Henry Tudor, the second son of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, was not expected to be king. His elder brother, Arthur, was the heir, groomed for the throne. Young Henry was a spare. A second act, a contingency plan. But fate, in its cruel humor, snatched Arthur from the world at 15. Suddenly, the spare became the center of England's future. And in 1509, at the tender age of 17, Henry VIII ascended to the throne. And what followed was nothing short of a Shakespearean metamorphosis. A monarch who would go from Renaissance icon to a human grotesquerie. A breathing, rotting monument of divine arrogance, collapsing under the weight of his sins, flesh, and festering sores. In his youth, Henry was everything a monarch should be. Tall, athletic, intelligent, and cultured, he spoke multiple languages, jousted like a knight, danced with effortless charm, and wrote poetry that made courtiers swoon. Foreign ambassadors described him as a golden god. His complexion fair, his body muscular, his gait regal. He was England's Apollo, a creature seemingly forged by the heavens to rule with beauty, might, and divine purpose. But this was the beginning of a tragic and terrible illusion. What bloomed in splendor would decay, in rot, and the end would not be fit for a king. It was January 24th, 1536. A winter wind cut through Greenwich as the royal court gathered for sport and spectacle. The king, now in his mid-40s, donned his armor for a joust, eager to prove that age had not dulled the blade of his glory. But glory was fickle that day. As his armored steed charged, something went horribly wrong. The horse buckled. The great beast collapsed. And so did the king. Henry was thrown violently to the ground, and the full weight of his horse crashed down upon him. Witnesses screamed. The court panicked. The King of England, God's anointed ruler, lay motionless in the dirt. 2 full hours passed before he regained consciousness. Though he survived, he was never the same. The fall had ripped more than flesh. It opened a chasm inside him. His right leg, savagely crushed, developed an ulcer, an unholy wound. A hole that oozed and festered for the rest of his life. It was not merely a sore, gateway to hell. Stitched into his flesh, it exhaled a stench so unbearable that courtiers often fainted in his presence. No one dared show disgust, of course, not unless they fancied a visit to the scaffold. The ulcer became his legacy, an eternal rot that symbolized the decay of his soul and empire. But it wasn't just the leg that died that day. His temperament darkened. His paranoia bloomed. His heart, already sickened by power, grew crueler. That same month, he ordered the arrest and beheading of his second wife, Anne Boleyn, on charges so ludicrous they shocked even the most hardened cynics of the court. Some historians now believe the fall caused a traumatic brain injury, an invisible wound that mutated his personality into something more monstrous. Whether it was brain damage or simply the unmasking of his true nature, one fact remains clear. Henry VIII had begun his transformation from king to beast. After the accident, Henry's mobility declined rapidly. The once vigorous king grew sedentary. But his appetite, it only swelled. He consumed like a man trying to fill the void that had opened in his body and in his soul. The royal kitchens recorded staggering figures. A single day's feast might include whole swans stuffed with game, platters of beef, lamb, pork, pheasant, and eel pies, mountains of bread soaked in wine, rivers of ale, and oceans of claret. Vegetables were rarely seen, unfit for a king, he believed. His caloric intake easily exceeded 5,000 calories daily. His weight ballooned past 180 kilograms. His waist, once a trim 89 centimeters, swelled to over 137. His thighs rubbed raw. His chest sagged. He wheezed with every breath. He could barely walk. Soon he required a pulley system to be hoisted between chambers like an aging sack of meat. And yet, he still saw himself as England's Adonis. Portraits were commissioned to capture his imagined grandeur, not his collapsing body. The paintings lied, but no one dared paint the truth. Not the cavernous ulcers now appearing on both legs, not the blackened skin around his ankles, necrotizing in the candlelight, not the smell. Dear God, the smell, rancid, sweet, sour and putrid, like spoiled meat left in the sun. The infection was not just of the body. It was in the court, in the air, in every whisper behind closed doors. And the king. He no longer ruled with reason. He ruled with rage. By the early 1540s, the King of England had become a spectre in his own palace. The once mighty lion now prowled the halls with a cane, swaddled in velvet and brocade, his legs bandaged, leaking, rotting. Each step he took was accompanied by a grunt of agony, the ulcer on his thigh now deep enough to expose bone. It wept constantly, thick yellow pus tinged with blood, soaking through his linens. It smelled like a battlefield wound that had been left to rot under the summer sun. Physicians had tried everything. Poultices of rose oil and herbs, heated irons to cauterize the flesh, drainage tubes to suck out the poison. Nothing worked. The leg refused to heal, as if the body itself had declared mutiny against its king. And so, Henry lived in an empire of pain, one built on pillows, opium, and denial. His moods grew violent, unpredictable, paranoid. He lashed out at those around him, servants, wives, ministers, bishops, nobles. None were safe. He accused his most loyal advisors of treason at the drop of a hat. Thomas More, a dear friend once, was sent to the block. So was Thomas Cromwell, the very man who helped Henry crush the Catholic Church and build his empire. The court had become a haunted house of whispered prayers and sudden executions. A single sigh in the wrong hallway could send a man to the tower. Even Henry's own wives were not spared his fury. Of his 6 queens, 2 were beheaded. One, Jane Seymour, died giving him his precious son, Edward, the heir he had murdered and remarried for. But did her death move him? If it did, it was buried under another layer of fat, gout, and calculation. By 1546, Henry could barely leave his chamber. He sat atop his throne like a bloated idol, festering and furious, writing proclamations and executions with trembling hands. His fingers were swollen sausages, his eyes were bloodshot, his breath labored. His liver, they say, was failing. His kidneys were drowned in meat, alcohol, and painkillers. His bowels became irregular. He urinated blood, and still, he ruled. No one dared to mention the obvious, that their god-king had become a diseased carcass being kept alive by the machinery of state and fear. By late 1546, death was no longer stalking Henry. It was sitting beside him, whispering in his ear. He knew. Everyone knew, but none could speak it aloud. To suggest that the king might die was treason. To say the word death in his presence was to invite it upon yourself. And yet, his body told the tale louder than any sentence. His face was pale and waxy, his belly swollen and hard, his legs blackening with gangrene. The ulcers on his thighs had now merged into what one courtier described as a cavernous pit. The infection had reached his bones. The pain was so severe he often screamed through the night, screams that echoed through the walls of Whitehall like the cries of a wounded animal. His last meals were barely chewed. He could no longer sit upright without assistance. And still, surrounded by perfumed bedsheets, flickering candles, and the groveling murmurs of terrified men, Henry VIII insisted he was not dying. He ordered more marriages for his children, more executions for his enemies. He revised his will. He smiled as he signed death warrants. But on January 27, 1547, at the age of 55, Henry VIII could no longer lie to himself. He was dying, and even the divine right of kings could not stop what was happening inside his gut. His doctors, too afraid to pronounce him near death, simply watched as he began to fade. His speech became slurred. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He lost control of his bowels. The royal bedding was soaked in urine, blood, and the pus of his ulcers. The stench was unholy. No candles could mask it. No perfumes could disguise it. The courtiers held their breath. Literally, he whispered nonsense. He clutched at ghosts. He cursed names only he could hear. Then, as dawn broke on January 28th, the King of England exhaled one final, shuddering breath and died. But the nightmare was just beginning. Death, in its mercy, had finally claimed him. But Henry's body refused to go quietly. He was placed in a lead-lined coffin, sealed shut with layers of wax and metal. But the stench, my God, the stench, still leaked out. His body was too bloated, too decomposed, too full of gases and fluid to contain. As the coffin made its way to Windsor for burial, it was temporarily housed at Sion Abbey, a former nunnery Henry had once desecrated during the dissolution of the monasteries. There, the unthinkable happened. The coffin ruptured. Putrefying bodily fluids burst forth and leaked onto the chapel floor. Legend says a strayed dog wandered in and began lapping at the king's spilled remains. Observers were horrified, but some whispered it was divine justice, prophecy fulfilled. Years earlier, a friar had preached that the dogs will lick his blood as they did Ahab's. Now, Henry VIII, who had broken with the Pope, decimated the church, killed wives, slaughtered heretics, and declared himself the living head of Christendom, lay burst and dishonored in a puddle of his own decay. His body was eventually entombed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in a grave so plain and unremarkable that for centuries, no marker existed. The man who had claimed to be England's God King was now a bloated carcass buried beneath the floor. What did Henry leave behind? A broken kingdom, a religious schism that would claim tens of thousands of lives over the next 100 years. A country soaked in Protestant and Catholic blood. A fragile monarchy ruled first by his sickly son Edward, then by his murderous Catholic daughter Mary, and finally by his other daughter, Elizabeth, who would spend her life cleaning up his mess while dodging plots, popes, and poison. His 6 wives became symbols of survival, martyrdom, and tragedy. His enemies became martyrs. His friends became victims. His body became legend. Henry VIII, once the golden boy of Christendom, died a grotesque, paranoid tyrant, drowning in his own rot and cruelty. But perhaps worst of all, he was never sorry. He believed until the very end that he was right, that God approved, that his ulcerated body, his grotesque appetite, his blood-stained hands were all part of divine providence. That is the horror. Not that he died in filth, but that he died believing he was clean. Henry VIII left a model of monarchy built on indulgence, punishment, and fear. His lavish spending bankrupted the treasury. His personal vendettas became public policy. And his appetite for food, for women, for control, became England's burden. He is remembered today with a morbid fascination. History books soften him. Films glamorize him. But peel back the velvet, and you'll find the bloated body of a man who turned a nation into his mirror, filled with contradiction, cruelty, and unspeakable rot. Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant. He was a living infection, a monarch whose power metastasized until it poisoned every corner of the realm. His death didn't bring justice or redemption. It brought silence, unease, and the long shadow of a man who ruled like a god and died like a beast.